Attachment by Andrew Ramsey for writing in psychology. Here's a picture of a mother and her child, which is showing us a good example of what attachment really is. You see the mother's attachment and affection towards the child. And that's what we're really going to talk about today, is how does this affection begin? Does it begin naturally? Is it something that the parents teach them? And that's really what we're going to try and figure out when it comes down to the test that we're going to talk about here in a little bit. But we're going to start off with, how do we learn affection? Do we learn it by classical conditioning, or do we learn it by operant learning? You're probably asking yourself, what are these two types of learning? Well, we're going to talk about them here in just a second. Classical conditioning is basically the process of a child or an animal getting something given to them after they complete a task. Say a child needs to learn to be potty trained. It can be trained to do this by giving it a reward every time it goes to the bathroom in the bathroom instead of in its pants. And after a while, when it learns this type of conditioning, we see it completely figure it out. Another example of this is when we see rats in a maze and we're trying to teach them how to successfully make its way through the maze. We'll put a piece of cheese at the end of the maze, and if they're able to complete the maze, they're able to get the piece of cheese. And the quicker they do this, the quicker they're able to get that piece of cheese that they love. So we see after a while that their times continue to speed up. So this is a example of a nurture type of learning, which is another part of what we're going to get to, how this is operant and classical conditioning are kind of like nature versus nurture, in my opinion. And we'll see that as we continue out through this talking of the two. Operant learning, on the other hand, is how a baby learns to get its mother's attention by crying. So basically, every single time a child cries, its parents are going to come into the room, or the person taking care of it's going to come into the room and see what's wrong with it. So the baby starts to learn that every time it cries, the parents are going to come in and see what's wrong, feed it, change it, bathe it, and the parents learn this effect that if they hear the baby crying, they're going to go in and check on it, which is causing this vicious cycle, which the baby probably should not learn, because it's learning if it cries, it gets what it wants, which is something they should. This is really a good example of how a child learns by nature, though, because it's not really learning by the nurture of its parents, by them giving him something for a reward. It's learning that every time the baby cries, it's going to get what it wants. It's naturally learning this as if it's something that's innate in the baby itself. So maybe affection is built by nature, maybe it's built by classical conditioning, by the process of continued showing of the baby this affection by the parents. Maybe it's just the affection that it gets when it cries. Either way, it looks like both could be a very plausible explanation of how babies learn what affection is. But we're going to see if we can figure out a little bit better which does which, or if it's equal. So we're going to try and test this, and we're going to look into which one of these is best, and we're going to touch on the question of whether it's nature versus nurture, like we've been talking about this whole time, because it really is kind of a which one is better, and it's an age-old question throughout a lot of psychology. Is it nature? Is it nurture? And operant and classical, I feel, is a very good example of this on affection. So to try and help determine this, we're going to try and figure out which type of attachment style we have as we grow up. Do we have a secure attachment style? Do we have an avoidant style? Do we have an avoidant anxious style of affection? Because these are all figured out by how we were raised. Did our parents take care of us? Did they constantly stay around? Um, if we're secure, when our parents leave the room, they're typically, as children, we whine and we get sad. If we're avoidant, we get distressed and flip out a little bit more. And if we're anxious avoidant, we don't even care at that point because we don't really feel any affection from the parents at all, which is really sad. But these type of relationships show that they didn't really learn affection at that point. So to test this, we're going to try and figure it out by giving out a questionnaire, which will be able to help us determine whether you have a secure attachment or a avoidant attachment or an anxious avoidant. Because by determining which one of these you have, we can kind of begin to maybe make a correlation between affection and how we were brought about. Because if we see more people with secure attachments, I believe we can make a case that affection is based on either one of these or both, because you need to learn this affection from your parents in one way or the other. So we're going to take a look at this, and here are the expected results. We're going to take a questionnaire with about 81 students is what I'm assuming. If we look, I'm assuming we're going to get about 45, which is 55% of those is secure, which is what I would hypothesize. We also look at it and we see 23 avoidant and 13 anxious avoidant, which is probably about normal, because we're not going to see, in my opinion, at Eastern, a whole lot of anxious avoidant or avoidant, because we come to Eastern because we want to have relationships with our teachers. We want to have a relationship with each other because it's a smaller campus. That's how Eastern sells itself, is of one that's a family. So if that's the case, I would assume we would get more people with secure attachment styles just because of this. Like I said, as we saw, we pretty much had in line with what my hypothesis said. With these results, I believe we can show that there is a more, you can't really say one or the other is better, parent or classical conditioning, because I think both in the end are going to show some form of affection, and the children are going to learn that one way, either by whining and they're getting their parents' affection, or just by classical conditioning, finally getting it because that's just what they're going to get from their parents. So I believe that both are needed to learn affection. One may be better than the other, but that's not what we were trying to figure out. We're trying to figure out, where does this affection come from? And I think we can show that it comes from classical and parent learning as children as we grow up.